Hello, my name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and welcome to Wellness Live. We're so glad you've joined us here, and this broadcast is brought to you by Loma University Health's Department of Risk Management and our Wellness Program. Today we have an excellent presentation for you, and we are very excited to welcome Dr. Brian Bull to our Wellness Live audience today. And he's going to be talking about something we are all concerned about, and that is our gut. And with that, I want to give a little bit of an introduction on how special it is that we have him here. He is a professor of anatomy and pathology here at our School of Medicine. He is the former dean of our School of Medicine, and for 10 years, among the other things that he did, he was an editor-in-chief of an international peer-reviewed journal, and he has reviewed many articles and scrutinized them for their scientific validity for publication. So we are very excited here today, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Brian Bull.
Thank you, Olivia, for that generous introduction. I'm going to talk today, obviously, about the gut, but I'm going to talk about something that is related to the gut, but of more immediate interest to all of us, and that is the question of obesity. 2 of 3 Americans are overweight or obese, which is seriously overweight, and nobody knows why. Now, everybody has ideas. I have some. They may be correct. They may not. Pretty much everybody who's looked at this has ideas as to why we are overweight or obese. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is talk to you about how the gut plays into the possibility of the cause of obesity. Now, obesity is caused by eating too much. We do know why we're obese. We're consuming too many calories. And I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 takeaway messages as we go through this to help you keep track on where we are and what we're doing. This is takeaway message number 1. And superficially, it would look as if it's not too helpful. I mean, it's obvious that we're overweight because we're consuming too many calories. But the interesting question is, why has this taken place over the recent past? Why was it that for generations the average person was not overweight? I'll show you some data in just a moment. Why are we consuming too many calories? Well, to give you some idea of the seriousness of the situation in which we find ourselves, the chances of an obese person attaining normal body weight is 1 in 210 for men, 1 in 124 for women. Now that's less than 1% chance for women and 0.5% chance for men. Now the data is more discouraging. I mean, this is very discouraging. This sort of ability to recover from obesity is considerably poorer than the ability to recover from opioid addiction, like almost an order of magnitude poorer. It's probably pessimistic because what they did was they looked at the weight of actually over 1 million people in the UK health records and looked to see 1 year later if they'd recovered and were back down in those who were obese, if they were back down into a normal body weight. And as you can see, less than 1% chance of this transfer occurring. Their conclusion was a real downer. They concluded that dieting and exercise, which are basically the only things we've got to work with other than drugs and surgery, dieting and exercise are not effective in tackling obesity at a population level. Now that's a real downer because we're in trouble. 2/3 of us are overweight or obese, and dieting and exercise aren't going to work to improve the situation. So maybe we just give up. But there's a very good chance, and I'm trying to make the case in the next few minutes, that the cause of obesity has something to do with the food that we eat. It makes a certain amount of sense. So let's look at 5 major changes in the food that we eat over the last time period because if they all have something in common, it's at least possible that that thing that's in common is the cause of the obesity crisis that's facing us. And it's not just an obesity crisis. If present trends continue, 1 in 3 children born today will be diabetic before they die. 1 in 3. So takeaway message number 2 is whatever correlates, that means whatever went up or down or over the last time period in our diet may in fact be causing obesity and diabetes. Well, most people seem to think that this is a fairly recent phenomenon, but it isn't. It started over a century ago, and here's the information that proves that. These are the weights of, and their BMIs, body mass index, which is a simple calculation, but the normal is below 25. And if you look back in 1890, everybody was either normal or we had a very few people that were overweight and nobody was obese. These lines are decile lines, so 10% of the population is above this line and 10% of the population is below this line, and all of these are the intervening 10%. So let's look at this top line. It crosses the mark of obesity, which is a BMI of 30 in 1910. It crosses BMI of 35 in 1940. This is severe obesity. And the chances of these people actually recovering, if followed for a year, are less than 1 in 2,000. And so in 1940, 10% of the population was seriously obese. In 1980, where are we here? Almost 35% of the population is seriously obese. Now, this is not the U.S. population. This is taking 50-year-olds, all of whom were born 50 years previously, and measuring their weights. Because obviously, in the total American population, you've got people coming into the country, you've got a variety of shifts in the population. But these were all born in the U.S. and weighed and their height measured 50 years later. So as I said, this is the normal, up to 25. This is normal weight. 1/3 of us are still here. This is overweight, 25 to 30. This is obese, anything over 30, and anything over 35 is seriously obese. But as you can see, this trend has been going on for 100 years. So whatever causes obesity has to have been affecting us for over 100 years. So 50-year-olds have been getting fatter for more than 100 years, which is takeaway message number 3. And so let's look at the dietary changes over the last 100 years that might have made us fat. Well, here are 5 dietary changes. I've just picked 5. There's a lot of dietary changes, obviously, the number over 100 major dietary changes. I've picked 5, spaced roughly the same number of years apart, 20 or so. These arrows don't correlate exactly with the dates, but they're approximately correct. And let's look at them one at a time. The first, and one of the most important, occurred just at the turn of the century. So between 1890 and about 1910, the millers in the US and in England and in Western Europe switched from stone mills to steel mills and were able for the first time to remove all of the bran and from the wheat germ in the process of milling. When they did that, they got pure white flour, which is a combination of starch and protein, with no fiber in the diet. That caused a series of nutritional problems, and so after a few years, it was enriched. We know that about 19 vitamins and minerals are removed in the milling process. 4 have been added back, and the people that did that get to call their flour enriched. 19 removed, 4 replaced. And then along about 1906, I'll go into this in somewhat more detail, cornflakes were introduced. Now, not to be too hard on cornflakes, this is just the just to make it clear that it was about this time that, for the first time, ready-to-eat breakfast cereals came along. And then fast food. White Castle was introduced in the East Coast about the 1930s, 1935, and then, of course, the rest of the fast food restaurants came in over the next 20 years. One of the significant insults to the diet was bottomless sodas, where you could go and buy one soda and refill it as often as you liked. And something that most of you will probably not have heard about, but has to do with the fact that the U.S. government requested the food industry to double the number of low-fat foods. At the time, there were 2,500 approximately. They wanted that raised to 5,000, and this was about 1980 or so. So what we've been doing is messing with our diet and changing the food pyramid. You've all heard about the pyramid. And the food pyramid, we've changed it from all meat to all veggies. We have a variety of diets, over 1,000. 300 or 400 have been scientifically analyzed. And over the last 100 years, we've been changing from one diet to another. And there's the diet of the month and the diet of the week, and I think we're getting down to the diet of the day. And in the process of doing that, our food has changed. And it's changed in ways that we may not even realize it could change. Because underneath the food pyramid that we humans understand is another food pyramid for the microbes in our gut. The microbes in our gut do not get proteins, carbohydrates, and fats that we humans use. They get the fiber that's in all of these foods that I'm going to make the case has been going missing slowly and steadily over the last 100 years. This little device here is the ileocecal valve. It's then this is the human food pyramid, and this is the microbe munchie pyramid. And I'm ready for questions, Olivia.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And for those of you who are watching us live on YouTube or Facebook, we definitely want you to type in your questions. So we have the expert here. So Dr. Bull, I want to ask you a question. Why would people lose weight with an increase in fermented fiber instead of gaining weight? So a lot of people think, well, I'm eating more, shouldn't I be gaining?
Well, in fermented fiber, typically you're not eating more. I mean, it's what's present in normal foods, and it's been going missing. But your question is certainly a very real one, because when the fiber ferments in the large gut, the bacteria digest it, because they have enzymes that we don't possess. So they can actually digest it. They produce something that we'll talk about in the next 10 minutes called SCFAs, short-chain fatty acids. And that is additional calories for us. So it's a very good question, and I will tackle it as we get to it.
Yes. The next one. So when you see these changes in diet, when it comes to obesity and
diabetes and
yes, all of the other things that come with obesity, when you look at our food pyramid, are we just not getting what is in the food pyramid, or are we getting it and we really need to focus on what the food pyramid is telling us?
Well, the food pyramid on the top is what we are aware of. It's proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. It's the kinds of things that you read on food labels. And those are assumed by most people to be all that our diet consists of. And in many people that's true, and that's unfortunate, because 100 years ago our diet consisted of a lot of additional things that were in this lower pyramid, and the bacteria, in the process of metabolizing those things, produce all sorts of very useful things for us, for our bodies. And they no longer have those food items because we've taken them out. And we've taken them out without realizing what we were doing, because up until about 10 years ago, nobody was interested in the large bowel and the bacteria 4 pounds or so of bacteria that inhabit that, and whether or not they were being fed.
4 pounds.
Yeah,
Wow.
or less.
So here we have another. So how much fiber should I eat per day? If we're talking
well,
about,
yes,
yeah.
we'll get to that too, because the more the better for the time being.
Okay. Well, let's get to the next half then.
Yes,
So,
let's go
yeah,
to the
let's
next half,
do
and
that.
then we'll have more questions. All right, this is where we left the first half before I showed you the 2 food pyramids. And these were 5, not entirely picked at random, but they were picked to just show what has happened in the last 100 years to our foods. We've gone to enriched white flour, which took out all of the wheat bran. We went to cornflakes, which took out of the corn bran. We went to fast food and bottomless sodas and low-fat foods. And so now let's look at this in somewhat more detail. Here is the human food pyramid, and here is the microbe munchy food pyramid. And the microbes need food just like we do too. This is the original food pyramid with people think that it's terrible now because it had all breads and pasta and cornflakes at the bottom of it. And one of the more popular diets says these things we shouldn't even be eating. So this is the upper gut. All of these foodstuffs are digested and absorbed in the small intestine. This is the lower gut. All of these foodstuffs are digested and absorbed in the large bowel. So here's a picture of the small intestine. It's a somewhat idealized picture of what we look like inside. And these are the carbohydrates and the proteins and the fats that constitute what we consider to be our diet. These are the things that have gone missing over the last 100 years. Hemicellulose, pentosands, phytic acid. I mean, most people never heard of these, and they're certainly not worried about how much of them they have. Inulin, mucilage. Inulin you may have heard of. It's one of those that's been examined. Mucin, beta-glucans, resistant starch. So these are the microbe munchies, and they are in the large bowel, and the foodstuffs of the bacteria, they are present. Human food in the upper pyramid, microbe munchies in the lower. Now let's take a look at what happened to these 2 pyramids over the last 100 years that may have something to do with why we're getting fatter. 1885 to 1905, grain millers switched to steel roller mills from stone mills. The steel roller mills made it possible for them to remove the entire wheat germ. They can pop it out of the wheat berry, and then they can turn the wheat berry around and remove all of the bran. So now what's left? Mills to pure white flour, and it's starch and protein, and there's nothing else in it. What did that do? Well, it got rid of the wheat germ, and it got rid of wheat bran, which shrunk the microbe munchies food pyramid. The next thing that happened to the 2 pyramids, John Harvey Kellogg takes corn germ and fiber out in the process of making cornflakes. Well, cornflakes were in fact probably healthier than the breakfasts at the time, but in the process, again, it's going to affect the lower pyramid. And to make matters worse, he had a fight actually with his brother William because he wanted to add sugar to cornflakes to make them more addictive, more appetite, or more to increase their attraction for people. Well, Will Kellogg won the battle, and that's how we got W.K. Kellogg cornflakes. They were invented actually by his brother, but because he added sugar to cornflakes, he got to take over the manufacturer, and that increased the upper food pyramid. Remember, these are proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. He added carbohydrates to this upper part, and so now we've got an imbalance as a result of the white flour and as a result of cornflakes. Let's keep going. What happened next was fast food eateries appeared. And of course, in fast food, you add sugar to most things. It's amazing how much sugar is in fast food items. and that increases the size of the human food pyramid, and they reduce the food fiber. It's very difficult to get whole wheat or whole grain anything in a fast food, and so this gets smaller. Well, you've got the picture. You can see what's happened every time these changes have occurred. We've enlarged this one and made this one smaller. Oh, and then, of course, along came free soda refills. Now, there's obviously no microbe munchies at all in soda refills. And in fact, that all goes into this upper peak, which has now gotten so big it's gone off the top of my screen. But same problem, and more imbalance. And finally, something that I mentioned that nobody really knows about because nobody's heard about it. Healthy People 2000, the U.S. government went to food processors and said, look, we want more foods that are low in fat and low in saturated fat, because we think that it's fat and saturated fat that's causing the obesity epidemic. So we already have 2,500 food items, and we want you to make 2,500 more by the year 2000. And the food industry responded. Well, there's only proteins, carbohydrates, and fats in the human food pyramid. So if you're going to decrease the fat and the saturated fat, and you still have the same amount of food, you've got to increase one of the other two. And the one chosen was the cheapest one, which is carbohydrates. So we got a lot of low-fat items, but they were high-carbohydrate items. And again, there was essentially no fiber accompanying these because it was largely sugar and things like that that were added to our food supply. This is at the request of the U.S. government. So here's our 2,500 new low-fat foods. So for 100 years, everything done to the food has increased the size of the human food pyramid and or decreased the size of the microbe munchie pyramid. This is takeaway message number 4. And obviously I am suggesting that this is possibly the cause of the obesity epidemic. Here's the physician saying, don't eat anything fatty. And he says, like donuts and stuff? And the doctor says, you're not listening, fatty. I said, don't eat anything. And he's talking about proteins, carbohydrates, and fats again. So let's consider somebody whose diet hasn't changed any in the last 100 years. And why? What might we consider this female lowland gorilla? Well, first of all, I like the expression on her face. She looks like somebody who knows what she's about and is not to be trifled with. And I think she's eating arugula. No, she's actually eating some of the grass and leaves. And the reason I chose a lowland gorilla is that, as you may have heard, I'm also I know something about anatomy because I'm a professor in part of that. And in the anatomy of a lowland gorilla is very similar to human anatomy. In fact, if you were to take out the stomach, esophagus, small bowel, large bowel, this is the large bowel, and lay it on a dissecting table, apart from the fact that it would be a little bit larger than humans, it looks exactly the same. And it has sort of similar microbiome in it. So what does a lowland gorilla eat, and what did she eat 100 years ago? It's a fairly high protein diet, 24% protein. How does she get protein? The answer is ants. She spends most of the day eating ants. They're pretty high in protein. In fact, there is the suggestion that we're all going to start eating insects sooner or later because that's the easiest way of getting protein in the diet, the cheapest. Carbs 15%, fats 2.5%. How do we know that? Well, somebody followed a lowland gorilla around, and every time she ate something, they took an equivalent amount, put it in a baggie, and took it back to the laboratory and analyzed it for proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, the elements in the human food pyramid. But if you add these up, it doesn't come anywhere near 100%. So where is she getting the rest of her metabolic requirements from? And the answer is that if you put fiber into the large bowel, what the microbes there produce are called short-chain fatty acids, SCFA, from fermentable material, dietary fiber, such as inulin, beta-glucans, hemicellulose. These are all carbohydrates, but they're hooked together in such a way that the human gut, the human intestinal system can't break them down. We only have a few enzymes that will break down carbohydrates, and those enzymes won't tackle these sorts of things. The bacteria, on the other hand, have all of the enzymes necessary to break these down, so they break them down. And they produce, as a result, short-chain fatty acids, SCFA. This particular one is actually acetate, and it's what you have in vinegar. It's it has very interesting effects, but that's for another time. This is propionate. It too has. It's essentially a statin-like compound that's produced in our gut. This one is butyrate, and it nourishes the wall, the lining of our gut. And these SCFA in the lowland gorilla account for more than half of our metabolic requirements. Now, why is this important? Well, more than half of her metabolic requirements are coming from things that do not require insulin for getting them into cells and getting them metabolized. So these produce more than half of the daily metabolic requirements. And they're important because 100 years ago, about 20 to 25% of our daily requirements came from SCFAs. But because of what I've showed you has happened to our food supply, now we're down to maybe 5% or 7%. So on a diet rich in munchies, that can rise to 20% or more. We don't know what the upper limit is for humans. We know that it can go as high as 60% for a lowland gorilla who has a very similar digestive tract. All right, now I'm a scientist, and you would expect me, I'm sure, to give you scientific data backing up these claims. Nobody has done the necessary work, but they have looked at the effect of high fiber diets on a whole series of other things besides obesity. They have in fact looked at the effect on diabetes, and here is the effect. This is the normal death rate. This is the incidence of type 2 diabetes. And the higher the total fiber in grams per day, the lower the incidence of diabetes. In fact, here we're down to about a 40% decrease in diabetes. These are all the studies, these circles. The big circles are big studies, and the little circles are little studies. But there's no question that the more fermentable fiber you have in the diet, the less likely you are to have diabetes. And if instead of going from 1 in 3 of our children developing diabetes, we were to go to 1 in 6, that would be an enormous improvement. We probably would go even lower than that. I'll show you one more slide. This is total mortality. The higher the fiber, the less chance you have of dying in any given year. Here is all-cause mortality, and as you can see, same line going downhill. Not quite as steeply as it does for diabetes, but it gets down to about 80%, so you have a 20% less chance of dying in any given year if you have 30 grams of fiber in your diet. And with that, I think we're now ready for your questions.
Yes. And so, Dr. Bull, you've talked about fermentable fiber. Let's define what that is and where do we get it?
There's two kinds of fiber. Remember, all of these fibers are the same molecules, glucose and fructose and things like that, hooked up in the form of these fermentable carbohydrates that we can't ferment. We can't digest them. So the microbe munchie pyramid is made up of all of these fibers. Now, there's a few that even the bacteria can't digest, and that's what's called insoluble fiber. The technical term of soluble fiber means that the bacteria in our gut can break them down.
So with that, I know our viewers, and they're seeing all this information and seeing obesity can be helped, diabetes can be helped. When they go to the grocery store, what do they buy?
Well, this is, the short answer is beans and greens.
Okay.
Because essentially all processed foods, as I've shown you, except for whole wheat, whole grain breads and whole grain cereals. Even then, they're a little suspect. But all other foods essentially have been depleted of this lower pyramid over the last 100 years.
Interesting.
So there isn't very much out there for them to buy. You pretty much have to do it yourself.
Interesting. So at least we can take the beans and greens take-home message.
Oh, yeah.
So to increase
they
that in the diet.
haven't been processed, yes.
Okay. So you're a scientist, and so what you're telling us is based on scientific research. So this is almost certainly correct?
When you're dealing with food and dietary analysis, you're in a realm of scientific fact that is very much more uncertain than, say, physics, space travel, light analysis, things like that. If you had 3 levels of reliability of scientific fact, this would be the lowest level. Why? Well, because humans are notoriously unreliable in telling you what they ate yesterday and what they ate last week, even worse. And then if you put them on a diet and they promise, cross their heart, that they'll stick with it, the chances of all of them sticking with it for more than 2 weeks is slim. So essentially, to do any of these studies, you would have to take a large population of humans, you'd have to feed them 3 meals a day, and you'd have to make sure they didn't eat anything else. And then you'd have to have a control group. These get horrendously expensive, and nobody has ever actually done such a study. The American Heart Association, who's been recommending what we should be eating, finally admitted about, 3 years ago, that such a study has never been done. So this is a very uncertain, I call it an explanation most uncertain, an emu. And this is the lowest quality emu. So dietary studies are inherently uncertain. So I think I'm right, but I will have to admit that it's one of the areas that it's very difficult to be sure. And that's why everybody has their own opinion.
Right. But we probably could agree on, and we could suggest, is that the beans and greens, eating whole foods, regardless of anything, is a good idea.
Absolutely.
Is a good idea. And then people can go out
Yes.
and do that right now. Now, I know a lot of maybe our viewers have watched TV, and we have teas, and we have, yogurt being promoted, and prebiotics and probiotics, and they're putting it in juice and all kinds of things. And, they're talking about the gut, and, they're promoting a lot of these prebiotics and probiotics as if you get your gut health right, you're going to lose weight, and, so drink my tea or do whatever. What are your thoughts about what's happening right now in the food industry?
Well, it's clear this is something that's only come up in the last probably 7 years. And I think it's fascinating. I think that the secret does lie here. I think that diet and exercise, exercise, by the way, is not viewed as the solution, because the more you exercise, the more your appetite increases. So it's useful, it's very useful, but it's not going to solve the problem. Diet will, I think, if we make the appropriate changes. The changes that occur with probiotics and prebiotics are so small compared to the 4 pounds of bacteria that are down there, that they rarely are detectable 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later. Yes, you can detect them sometimes if you take a very large dose for a few days. But changes in the microbiome require changes in diet, and they require consideration of the microbe munchies pyramid.
Okay. So, in summary, just for practical use for all of us, the pills, the teas, the juices, all of these things can never replace going back to the diet and saying more beans and more greens.
And more foods that still have the complete. I mean, you can eat cereals, or cereals constitute the major element of our diet. The top 3 caloric-containing foods that constitute our diet are all based on wheat. They're pies, cakes, pastries, donuts, and all that sort of stuff. And so we have to be able to eat those things, but we need then to go back to fully whole grain wheat, whole grain corn, those sorts of things. And somebody needs to manufacture a food that's even over on the microbe munchy side. And nobody's interested in that, because it would be not particularly tasty, and it would be expensive. So you can't really find foods in the grocery store other than things that plants and beans and things like that haven't been messed with. You can't really find anything that once you started down this road to gaining weight that will get you back on the straight and narrow. So your only solution is to starve yourself and then start all over again with these kinds of foods.
Well, one thing that is exciting about what you've told us here is that we can do something today.
Sure.
In changing your diet.
Yeah.
So, we can empower people and all of us to actually improve what we're doing right now. So, well, with that being said, we want to encourage all of you to take care of your health and add beans and greens and whole grains to your diet. So again, I would like to thank Dr. Bull for being here. Thank you for watching. And I want to suggest that you can come back here on May 29th to see our next Wellness Live with Trevor Wright. And he will be talking about finding wellness in a busy and demanding life. So again, thank you. This has been Wellness Live. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and we'll see you next time.